Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most famous, baffling, and, let's be honest, downright unsettling stories in all of modern literature, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. We're going to map out the literal horror of the text, look at the intense biographical parallels from Kafka's own life, and dig into the heavy existential philosophy running right under the surface. So, let's decode this absolute nightmare together, shall we?
Okay, let's dive into this because it is arguably the greatest opening line in fiction. Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning from unsettling dreams to find himself transformed right there in his bed into a gigantic insect. It's an instant, totally absurd hook, but beyond the sheer shock value of it all, what does that actually mean? To literally be stripped of your human form overnight, it's a waking nightmare, and it immediately challenges everything we think we know about identity, about purpose, and really the whole human condition.
Section 1. Waking up a bug. Kafka didn't actually just call Gregor a bug. In the original German text, he used the word Ungeziefer. Historically, back in Middle High German, this didn't just mean some annoying household pest. It referred to an unclean animal, a creature totally unsuitable for religious sacrifice. Kafka deliberately chose a word that immediately brands Gregor as profoundly impure, unworthy, and completely severed from anything sacred. So the horror here isn't just physical, it is deeply spiritual.
And when Gregor transforms, he instantly loses everything that defined him, right? He can't work, he can't speak, he can no longer maintain his role as the family's provider. What's absolutely wild is that the story flat out refuses to give us any scientific or supernatural explanation for the change. It just is. He's trapped in this submissive, entirely powerless state. In fact, hanging on the wall in his room is a framed print of the painting Venus in Furs. This is a famous nod to themes of domination and submissiveness, and it perfectly mirrors Gregor's newfound impotence against the crushing weight of his new reality.
Section 2. Kafka's real-life parallels.
And this brilliantly illustrates the intense parallels between the fictional and the real. On one side, we have our fictional Gregor, trapped in this soulless routine as a traveling salesman and totally submissive to his domineering father. Then, on the other side, we have Franz Kafka himself, relentlessly working in an asbestos factory, relentlessly bullied by his loud, overbearing father Hermann, and living right between his parents' bedroom and the living room in terribly tight, incredibly noisy quarters. Gregor's miserable existence was a direct mirror of Kafka's own oppressive, suffocating reality.
The claustrophobia Kafka felt must have been just suffocating. He actually wrote in a letter once, "I have always looked on my parents as persecutors." Can you imagine living day in and day out with people you feel that way about? His intense hypersensitivity to noise and this deep self-disgust he carried, it all stemmed directly from living in such close, inescapable proximity to a loud, domineering family for his entire life.
Kafka's psychological landscape was, frankly, a total minefield. By day, he worked at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, handling injury claims from lone, injured workers going up against massive, indifferent corporations. He was literally watching the bureaucratic machine crush the individual on a daily basis. He suffered from severe depression and was constantly terrified that everyone would just abandon him if they saw through his facade. And interestingly, scholars have noted he experienced a sort of reversed Oedipal dynamic, forming an incredibly intense, almost exclusionary bond with his youngest sister Atla. Yet through all of this, his true devotion was singular, as he famously declared to his fiancée, "I am made of literature." That depressed state, that soulless daytime job, and this incredibly complex family web, all of it provided the raw, emotional fuel for Gregor's story.
Section 3. The historical context.
The actual conception of this story is so fascinating. Picture this. It's November 1912. Kafka is lying in bed, completely sleep-deprived, incredibly frustrated, and agonizingly waiting for a letter from his new romantic interest, Felice Bauer, over in Berlin. On a dreary Sunday morning where literally everything seemed to be going wrong, the idea for the Metamorphosis just haunted him. He eventually abandoned the novel he was actually supposed to be working on and instead spent about 3 weeks furiously pouring this little story onto paper. Now, it wouldn't actually see publication until 1915, but that hectic, highly anxious morning birthed an absolute masterpiece.
Now, what's really interesting about this detail is that the origin of that word, vermin, is specifically tied to his father, Hermann, who had heavily internalized the anti-Semitism of the era. When Franz brought home his friend, a Yiddish theater actor named Yitzhak Lowy, Hermann was furious. He viciously compared Lowy to vermin. Imagine the sting of that.
Kafka took his father's cruel, real-world insult, an insult aimed directly at a good-hearted friend, and weaponized it into the core metaphor of dehumanization for the entire story.
Section 4. The existential nightmare.
So let's take a look at how Kafka weaves these really dense philosophical concepts right into the narrative itself. We can map out 4 core pillars of existentialism at play here. First, there's alienation, seen when his loss of bodily control creates this massive detachment. Then absurdity, which is found in the intense tension between his human mind and his deformed bug body. Next, a total crisis of identity, shown through his desperate false sense of belonging. And finally, bad faith, where he just completely denies his current reality. Let's look a bit closer at a few of these, shall we?
Let's start with the concept of absurdity, famously championed by Albert Camus. Camus defined the absurd as the conflict between the innate human desire for meaning and a cold, totally uncaring universe. Take this heartbreaking moment from the text when Gregor hears his sister playing the violin. He wonders, was he an animal that music could move him so? It completely exposes the painful, unbridgeable contradiction of Gregor's existence. He has this beautiful, deeply feeling inner soul, but it's permanently trapped inside a revolting, instinct-driven outer shell.
Then we have alienation. And this is where Marxist and existentialist viewpoints intersect perfectly. In a modern, money-driven world, a person's worth is often cruelly tied entirely to their financial output, right? The very moment Gregor can no longer earn a paycheck, his family's perspective shifts completely. They go from seeing him as a vital, respected provider to a worthless, disgusting burden. His ties to humanity are completely severed the second his economic utility drops to zero.
And all of this leads to a total identity crisis. You see, Gregor's identity was never really his own to begin with. It was always defined by what he did for others. Even as a giant insect, he clings to these tiny scraps of validation. When he gets just a momentary, halfway decent glance from his family, he thinks to himself, he felt integrated into the family circle again. It is just so tragic. It's this false, desperate sense of belonging from a family that only ever valued him for his labor. He has absolutely no core self outside of their expectations.
Section 5. The burden of freedom.
So, the crucial point is understanding what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith. He defined it as the phenomenon where people basically trick themselves into ignoring their own innate freedom. Instead of actively choosing their own path, they just blindly adopt preset roles handed down to them by society or their families. And honestly, it is the absolute perfect diagnosis for Gregor's inescapable psychological trap.
The real tragic irony of the story is that Gregor is literally paralyzed as a giant bug, practically glued to the floor of his room, and yet he still refuses to accept his reality. He actually lies there reflecting on his past, feeling proud that he was able to provide such a beautiful apartment for his family. He remains totally mentally enslaved to his old, unauthentic identity as the breadwinner. He is quite literally practicing bad faith, even in his mutated form, completely refusing to acknowledge that his old life is gone forever.
Let's move on and see how this builds into something even more paradoxical. Gregor's physical transformation actually gives him the ultimate existential freedom. Think about it. He never has to go to a job he hates ever again. He doesn't have to pay off his parents' debts anymore. He is totally, completely free from society's rules. But as existentialists constantly warn us, absolute freedom in an indifferent universe isn't a gift. It's a crushing burden. For Gregor, this unrestricted freedom strips away the only identity he ever knew, leading not to some grand liberation, but to total, inescapable isolation.
To bring our narrative full circle today, we really have to return to the author himself. Kafka basically encoded his own profound despair directly into Gregor's shell. As Kafka once wrote in a heartbreaking letter to Felice, "Life is merely terrible. I feel it as few others do. Often, I doubt whether I am a human being." Gregor Samsa isn't just some fictional character. He is the literal physical manifestation of Kafka's deepest, darkest anxieties about his own worth and his own humanity.
And that leaves us with a final, truly haunting question to ponder. We watch Gregor shed the heavy weight of his agonizing daily life, only to be immediately crushed by the weight of absolute alienation. So, was his freedom from those oppressive duties actually a release, or was it just a deeper plunge into an unavoidable existential void? It's a question that really challenges the true cost of living authentically in a totally absurd world. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep seeking those answers, and I'll catch you on the next one.